Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I'm taking you behind the scenes again in terms of sharing my thinking process as I prepare material for my personality disorders class. Since this is the 5th episode, and I guess what we can call now a mini-series, I want to briefly revisit a few of the core ideas we've covered thus far, especially what's happening in the inner world of narcissistic and borderline personalities. Not just the behaviors that we see on the surface. We're going a little bit deeper in this series. We talked about how narcissistic personalities tend to retreat into self-sufficiency, while people with borderline structures often move towards the other with a kind of intense emotional hunger, longing for someone who finally can soothe them, attune to them, and fill their deep sense of deprivation. In other words, somebody who's always there, someone who doesn't appreciate it when you are, and I do air quotes, leaving them. When stress rises and the other person isn't available to soothe, regulate, or meet a deeper need, self-reflection can collapse into immediate action. For some people with borderline organization, relating becomes very, and I quote again, literal rather than symbolic or reflective. And you may remember we spoke about this in a very early episode of the literal mode versus the representational mode of thinking and therefore of functioning. So in part, the treatment, and we spent some time talking about this in the prior episode, really is about helping the other person, for me, like helping the patient to regain a capacity to play psychologically, to move from a literal mode where everything feels concrete and urgent, don't leave, or why do you need to go to the gym, into a more symbolic space where feelings, thoughts, and relationships can be reflected on, imagined, or held in mind, even in somebody's absence. We also started to anchor all of this into the concept, and again I quote, object constancy, which some of you may remember if you've been listening along. That's the ability to hold on to a stable, caring sense of another person, even when they're not literally or physically and sometimes emotionally present. So that means if a loved one does step out or takes a vacation or travels or goes away or there's some kind of separation, you could still hold them in mind. When that capacity is fragile, it can feel, and I went again into this in so much more detail, but I just want to be careful not to go down a rabbit hole, but I quote, as if the relationship disappears the moment the other person isn't literally available. And then emotional arousal shoots up, leading to dysregulation. This is one way to make some sense out of this, of the emotional storms that you or somebody you may know experiences. This is one way to make some sense out of it, is to think about it in terms of literally needing somebody there and this diminished capacity, let's say, for the object constancy. Again, that concept that I defined in much more detail in the prior episodes. So, finally, we talked about the importance of containment in treatment. I say treatment, but again, this is my field. We could say containment personally, intrapsychically, or in healing relationships, being less focused on facts or explanation. So again, if somebody is getting aroused or is questioning, why do you need to go to whatever, staying less focused on the facts and explaining something to them and staying more attuned to the hidden meaning behind their complaints about you leaving and the unbearable feelings underneath the manifest behaviors. That's usually the anger, so that those feelings can gradually be named, held, and metabolized. In other words, make sense out of what you're experiencing in the moment. Make sense of what you are experiencing in the moment. I said that twice, yes, because that's the critical piece. And typically these feelings are around what? Loss. But it's not just loss. Anyway, look, there's still so much more to review. And again, I don't want to get too caught up in this because these are terms that we covered already. But I'm eager now to get into what we haven't yet explored. I hope this little review helped you consolidate some of the key organizing ideas we've been working with and returning to so that they can stay alive in your mind, object constancy, as we move forward into what we not have yet explored. So what haven't we yet explored? We haven't yet compared borderline rage with narcissistic rage, or even the deeper state that we may call hatred. So in this episode, I want to really look at three questions. First, what is rage? Psychodynamically, of course. What function does it serve inside the personality? Second, what is hatred? And how is it different from rage? And third, how do these states show up differently in narcissistic versus borderline structures? As always, my goal here isn't to pathologize emotions. It's to understand what the rage is doing for you, what it protects, what it wards off, and how it tries, in its own way, to stabilize a very fragile inner world. At a very high level, you can think about rage functioning differently in borderline versus narcissistic personalities. In borderline organization, rage is usually a protest against abandonment, something I was just mentioning a moment ago in the review. Terror that the relationship is slipping away, or that the person that you depend on has emotionally disappeared. In narcissistic organization, rage is much more about shame and humiliation, a reaction to feeling exposed, criticized, or made to feel small. The anger is used to restore control, superiority, or even distance. So, while the behaviors may look similar on the surface, psychologically they're serving very different purposes. When we focus on anger in borderline organization, we're really zeroing in on just one of the diagnostic criteria. In other words, this is just one of the things that make up the organization. And just to be clear, I'm not pretending the others don't exist. I actually reviewed them at the start of this episode, precisely so we could hold them the whole picture in mind while we take a closer look at anger, again, one of the criteria. In fact, I'm focusing on anger precisely because it's so deeply intertwined with everything else. So like, what is everything else? That's the intense fear of abandonment. Anger is involved with that. Unstable and intense relationships. Of course, you could see anger would lead to very unstable relationships. Impulsivity, which is often fueled by emotional arousal and anger. And affective instability. Those rapid emotional shifts that we typically see in the mood, all of which are either organized around anger, or anger quickly activates this level of affect, if we could call it labile, the shifting very quick in emotional states. So what I'm saying is the anger doesn't exist in isolation. It's wrapped into the entire emotional universe of the borderline experience. And this is one of the key differences with narcissism. Both narcissistic and borderline organizations can show anger and aggression, but in narcissism, anger is often expressed indirectly. Often, but not always. I want to emphasize that, okay? Just think about the, and I quote, malignant narcissist. Right there, it's more overt. But in general, anger is often expressed indirectly through contempt, withdrawal, guilt-inducing comments, or subtle devaluations. Think of the covert narcissist. The covert or more vulnerable narcissistic pattern may look, needy or injured on the surface, but the anger is still there. It's just channeled into a very different relational stance. And again, if you go back and review any of my earlier episodes, I have a series of episodes on covert narcissism where I go into that in far more detail. In borderline organization, the anger is often closer to the surface, hotter, more immediate, more intertwined with panic about losing the relationship, losing the other person. It's also important to note that many people with borderline traits never act aggressively. I want to point that out. That really deserves its own discussion. Perhaps we'll cover that in a future episode because it involves thinking about the different presentations of how anger can be managed, expressed, or I should say turned inward against the self. But again, a conversation for a later episode. What actually causes the anger in borderline personality disorder? And I like to ask it this way. It's at a slightly deeper level, not just what causes the anger, but the question in my mind becomes, what purpose does the anger serve? Why is it so necessary? I know that sounds paradoxical to you. You might be saying that's so silly to think that the anger is necessary. But what I'm suggesting is that we consider, why is it needed so urgently? There are many different theories about where anger comes from. Some point to constitutional or genetic predispositions. Others emphasize environmental trauma. And research generally suggests that roughly half of the causal picture lies in the environment. I've talked in prior episodes about how the developmental environments of people with borderline organization often differ from those with narcissistic structures. And I'll do a very quick review. In borderline development, we're often looking at more severe trauma, neglect, emotional deprivation, and even abuse, physical abuse, usually within a caregiving environment that is chaotic, unstable, or unreliable. So now that we've touched briefly, again, because I covered this in prior episodes, but I just wanted to keep it fresh in your mind, we touched on it briefly in terms of what causes or where the anger comes from. The next question becomes, what purpose does the anger serve? Remember, I just said a moment ago, that's of interest to me and hopefully to you. If you could think about it this way, that anger serves a purpose. From a psychodynamic perspective, anger in borderline organization isn't just a reaction. It serves several critical psychological functions. We won't have time to explore all of these today, so we'll focus on just a few key functions. For example, the anger can operate as a protest against abandonment, a desperate attempt to hold on to the relationship, or even punish the other person who ignored, turned away, left you, or seems about to leave you. That means they didn't actually literally leave you, but the fear is that they are leaving. So, just to be very clear, what we're exploring now is why the psyche relies on anger and aggression and how they serve to protect the self from collapsing under the weight of overwhelming vulnerability, loss being one of the key critical features here of what leads one feeling vulnerable. This way of thinking about anger naturally leads us to the discussion, and I quote, of hatred. That's a related, often more enduring defensive emotion, and I emphasize the word enduring because it's long-lasting, and it also serves to preserve the self when it feels at risk or that there is some perceived danger. Hatred is not just a more intense side of anger. I just want to be clear about that. It is often more enduring and, paradoxically, serves as a stabilizing function. That's one way to conceptualize the aggression, the anger, and now the hatred, that it serves as a stabilizing function. Again, that's the paradoxical twist that I'm encouraging you to consider. But let me say more about it. It's a way of keeping the internal world coherent, to keep it from collapsing, even when the person you're attached to and depend on feels unpredictable or inconsistent.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. We can think of borderline hatred in a few ways. It helps maintain object constancy through negative attachment. So it's almost like a negative object constancy. Let me explain. Even when the relationship feels lost or is at risk of being lost, hatred keeps the other person psychologically, and I quote, present, helping the self survive the fear of abandonment. So I hope that part is clear. You heard the emphasis. The hatred keeps the other person psychologically present. So let me give an example of that. This is something I notice quite frequently in my own practice with these individuals. Fights often break out in couples, in relationships, just before a loved one leaves, or conversely, at the end of a long, happy weekend together. It's almost as if you're saying, I would rather be negatively attached. That's what I meant by the reverse, the negative object constancy. It's like holding somebody in mind, but in a negative way. And by the way, when you're fighting and you're into something with somebody, you can imagine that they too keep you in mind. So there is a sense of togetherness, of attachment, right? Even though it's in the negative. In other words, the anger and hatred aren't just, and I emphasize the word just, destructive, because of course they are destructive in their own way. But I'm saying that they're also holding the self, yourself. They hold oneself together. How do they hold you together? They hold you together because when you're sort of entangled with somebody in hatred, in revenge, in the fighting, right? You are no longer alone. They are no longer alone. So they're not just picking a fight at random. They don't just pick a fight because they're looking for problems. They pick a fight for good reason, or you pick a fight for good reason. And that's why these feelings, by the way, like the hatred, which I said is long lasting, and it helps hold the self together. That's why these feelings don't simply disappear. Even if someone goes to an anger management class, because what's the goal of an anger management class? It's to get rid of your anger. But these classes typically don't take a psychodynamic perspective. They do not appreciate the subjectively useful component of this maladaptive symptom. So even if someone goes to this kind of class, or even when the anger and hatred cause tremendous relationship or relational pain, it doesn't simply go away. It's more complicated than that. We've talked about anger and hatred as forces that protect and stabilize the self in borderline organization. Now it's useful to think about one way anger and hatred differ, both within borderline as compared to narcissistic organization. Because that was part of the whole point of this miniseries. You might remember the course that I'm teaching is on borderline and narcissistic personality. So I'm doing a little compare and contrasting. In narcissistic organization, anger and even hatred are often what we call, and I'm quoting this, ego dystonic. In other words, they feel shameful or uncomfortable to the person who is experiencing these emotions. That's ego dystonic. Doesn't feel quite right. There's usually some awareness that the feelings are not fully aligned with the, and I quote, ideal self, which is part of the narcissistic organization. There's always a striving for the ideal, the perfect self. And the person wants to maintain this. So as you can imagine, the ego dystonic or dystonicity, if that's a word, arises because the anger and hatred pulls them away from their ideal image of themselves. By contrast, in borderline organization, anger can become more ego syntonic. So we move from ego dystonic to ego syntonic. In other words, it's experienced as completely acceptable because look at what you did to hurt me, and you deserve to be treated this way. After the angry or aggressive storm passes, the rage is not viewed as feelings to be reflected on or explored. They are felt as necessary because the other person is experienced as truly abandoning, abusive, or malevolent, or malignant, not just as a stand-in for someone from the past. In other words, they are literally experienced as abandoning. Even again, to use my example from earlier, when they're just running to the gym or running out for a moment. In those who are more narcissistically organized, with some guidance, they recognize that the hate is partly a distortion requiring understanding. So in other words, they could step back. There's a little more space to play around with it. Back to the word I used earlier when I said we need to move somebody from a literal to a representational mode. We need to help them learn how to play. But that's what I'm getting at right now. There's a little bit more space for this kind of reflection. In short, the key difference is that borderline anger and hatred are often fused with longing and experienced as urgent, immediate, and egosyntonic, whereas narcissistic anger and hatred are more defensive, ego-dystonic, and oriented toward protecting a fragile sense of self and self-esteem. So how do you handle it when these intense feelings show up? See, that's the critical piece, because my mind, and I always go over this in the course that I'm teaching, my mind is always on healing and treatment. How do we address these problems? How do we address the anger or the hatred, either in yourself or in someone you care about? Or for me, I could say in my practice with the patients that I work with. How do we do this? How do we handle these really intense feelings without getting swept away? What if, instead of seeing anger as a problem, we see it as a signal, a window into what's happening inside of yourself? So that question about what if we see the anger as a signal, I don't think is coming as a surprise to you, because through this whole episode, I think you've heard me allude to how the anger is the manifest presentation, but it's really the feelings that are going on underneath that we need to get into. Now, let's think about what all this means for managing these intense feelings. Whether you're someone who experiences them yourself or you're observing them in a loved one. If you're on the receiving end of someone else's stormy emotions, one of the most important things is having a steady presence. The goal is not to get swept up in the heat of the moment. When anger or rage shows up, you can start to imagine it's not just a problem, okay? I emphasize the word just. It's not just a problem, because of course I recognize that it is a problem, but we're trying to think about how we can manage the storm. But if we start to think of it more as a signal, already we could be in a more regulated state. It often points to a rupture or a strain in the emotional connection. So immediately we can begin to think, when anger presents itself, is there some sort of rupture? Is there a strain here? Something has gone wrong in the relationship or in how you or the person feels seen, understood, or safe. Because I could tell you right now, they don't feel safe. And that's why you see this presentation. Oftentimes, that's why you see the presentation of anger. In that sense, anger is trying to communicate something, even if it comes out as something overwhelming or destructive. It's a way of saying, I feel disconnected. I don't feel safe. I don't feel heard. And then recognizing it this way can shift how you communicate. So in other words, if this is resonating with you, and you'd have to think back to a time where you exploded or when you got angry, and you think, what preceded this? And if it's this feeling of not being connected, losing that attachment, now you could begin to at least think about, the next step would be communicated, of course. But the first step is to think about what's really going on inside of you. If you're the one experiencing this anger, it helps to notice what's happening inside yourself without letting the feelings take over completely. It's about what? Staying aware of the intensity without disappearing or shutting down. Not reacting impulsively, even when the anger feels overwhelming. And finally, observing your internal state. That's what I was just getting at a moment ago. What's really coming up for you and why that might be happening now. A practical strategy in both narcissistic and borderline rage is to slow down and track the emotional shifts. Ask, what happened just before this feeling? What happened just before I exploded? Or what am I reacting to? What am I really reacting to right now? Is it really about him going to the gym? This can create a small space to respond rather than react, which makes a huge difference in how the situation unfolds. All of this leads us to another key factor. Something else I just want to highlight very quickly because we have to begin to wrap it up. You may have heard of this concept. It's called rejection sensitivity. Research shows that, and I quote here, perceived rejection strongly triggers rage in people with both narcissistic and borderline organizations. This rejection rage reaction, I quote that's the rejection sensitivity. It forces this rejection rage reaction, is especially pronounced in borderline dynamics, highlighting how quickly interpersonal situations can activate intense anger, and in particular, those separations that I keep alluding to over the course of this episode. So what does this mean in terms of your emotions or relationships? Again, there's so much more here that I want to get into, but let me just say this last piece very quickly and then I'll wrap it up. Focusing on rejection sensitivity and interpersonal triggers can help both you anticipate and manage rage responses. I want to just give a very brief example of this. Oftentimes, before a holiday break or vacation, in my own practice with these individuals, I help these patients in advance get ready for the separation. I know that my leaving may be experienced as a pulling away, even if momentarily, and they might respond with sudden anger or withdrawal. Recognizing this pattern ahead of time, this would look like for you, for example, just to play out this scenario that I mentioned several times. If you know that you want to go to the gym, what would it cost you to let your spouse know that after work you're thinking about going to the gym? That's what I mean by planning in advance. Recognizing this pattern ahead of time, if you know that you're with somebody who has this, and I quote, rejection sensitivity, or personally, if you know now as I'm describing this and some of it resonates with you, that you tend to get upset when your significant other or somebody pulls away from you, this is something you begin to communicate in advance. Prior to, that's the key here, prior to the separation, rather than reacting after, and I quote, the abandonment. And yes, I use that word intentionally because that's the subjective feeling. Like this person doesn't care about me. It's so easy for them to leave. Or why didn't they tell me that they were thinking about going here or going there? So the plan is, before it escalates into a rageful, dysregulated response, is to plan this stuff, to talk about it in advance. To wrap up, I hope this helps slow things down, even though I felt a little pressured because there's so much I want to share with all of you. And I feel like I always want to keep these episodes to about 30 minutes or so, 25 to 30 minutes. So I try to squeeze in as much as I can, but I can feel sanguine about the fact that we will be back. We will be back next week with another episode. But I hope this episode helps slow things down and shed light on what rage and hatred are doing inside the personality. As always, there's still so much more to say, but I hope I've begun to highlight how these dynamics differ in borderline and narcissistic organizations. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.